Hello and welcome to Lit Talks. I'm Lisa Page and I am your host for this evening's event. Lit Talks is produced by the Connecticut Literary Festival, a program of the Central Connecticut State English Department and the College of Arts and Sciences. Thank you to our program sponsors, Real Art Ways, our J. Julia Bookstore, and the Yale Writers Workshop. And a very special thank you to the amazing Lit Talks producer, Christiana Torres, and the rest of the festival team. Next week, we conclude our Summer Lit Talk series with Korean American Literary Imaginaries, moderated by Na-Rae Kim. Please register for that event. And the festival is moving online this fall due to COVID-19 with more virtual Lit Talks, and these will run September through December. One highlight, Real Art Ways Executive Director Will Wilkins will sit down for a reading and conversation with Connecticut's own Wally Lamb on September 24th. Mark your calendars. The full schedule will be posted on the festival website in the coming weeks. And in addition, the festival is publishing the inaugural Connecticut Literary Anthology this fall, featuring 37 Connecticut poets and prose writers. Check out the cool cover on our site and be on the lookout for announcements and virtual readings. Thank you to everyone who submitted to the anthology. Tonight's program features two debut novelists. Edward A. Farmer is a native of Memphis, Tennessee, where he journaled and cultivated stories his entire life. And he is the recipient of the MacArthur-Leithauser Travel Award for creative writing and currently lives in Pasadena, California. Jotham Burrello is the author of the Writer's E-Handbook and producer of So, Is It Done? Navigating the Revision Process. He directs the Connecticut Literary Festival and the Yale Writers Workshop. He also curates the Roar Reading Series and is the publisher of the award-winning Elephant Rock book. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Lisa.
And as I mentioned earlier, this is the first novel for each of you. And with that said, novelist Norman Mailer said, writing a novel is at least as hard as learning to play concert piano. Would you agree with that, both of you?
Edward?
Yes, I would definitely say it is. It's definitely trial by error. It's figuring out yourself as well as your characters and trying to put something together that means something to you and would mean something to the readers. So yeah, it's definitely difficult.
Yeah,
I think it's just having the whole book in your head at one time. I know I took, Edward's a lot younger and more handsome than me. It took me a long time to do this. And for me, it was just, I did other things. And when I wanted to work on the book, to have it in my head took 2 or 3 months. And then I'm working on it. And that's tough. I think also you have to throw the bad stuff away. And I think as I got older, I knew it wasn't so precious. But that takes a lot of training, it's not easy.
No, again, like a concert pianist is what I'm saying. So would you please, each of you, give us a little flavor of your book by doing a brief reading for us, starting with you, Edward, please?
Yes, thank you, Lisa. I'd love to. Just to show you all a copy of it. This is my debut novel, Pale. And I'm going to read a section from the middle, toward the middle of the book. The book takes place in 1966, Greenwood, Mississippi, on a cotton plantation. And the story really takes off when Bernice, she goes to live with her brother as a servant on this cotton plantation. And at that time, the secrets of this plantation erupt. And they erupt when the missus of the house starts to flirt with a Black farmhand. And at that point, Bernice watches these events and realizes that she needs to do something. And so I'm going to read a brief part from the middle of the book. It's funny how a train sounds if it is not wanted. It carries with it no awareness of its hulking presence or the sharp scrape of metal during those slight turns through the countryside. It makes not that shushing sound that children love, achieving to impress no one. It is invisible and carries not the weight one would give a passing stranger who has little to distinguish himself from the person to his left or right. It is indeed unnoticeable. That this woman of fine descent, who had all the life left of an infant born to the care of 70 servants, had heard nothing of its approach, saw no car or coach or occupants as they scurried along the platform at Greenwood Station just after the screech in the dead of night, says it all. With sad eyes, she surveyed a note scribbled on wadded paper from some purchase she'd made a long time ago, indulging her fancy in rereading the not-so-legible script as she imagined the hand that had scribbled it, for that hand and its handsome owner would not leave the safety of her thoughts the entire afternoon and subsequent journey from Greenwood to Memphis and on to Little Rock, she would later tell me, and that says it all. I had seen the two together, not just that afternoon of her birthday, but several times during that 3-week period before the Mrs. departure for Little Rock, when her spirits sat at its lowest. I dare say they were friends, even though that simple notion was frightening in and of itself. They'd walked like lovers through the paths and in those wooded areas that kept private their secret affair, finding use for all those nooks and crannies just beyond the fields that stretched into the forest, although they had not yet shared a single kiss between them, as far as I could see. Still, they laughed with great frequency, although never too long, as even that bit of happiness was met by the Mrs.'s own wretchedness that precluded her from ever straying too far. Mr. Kern remained true to his nature too, tiring of her moods and paying no more attention to her dealings, which left her ample time to scurry off amongst the wild columbines and irises of the far fields, finding some quiet place where she could be alone with Jessie, and they could talk and whisper and behave like adolescents away from the prying eyes of adults. Part of her must have enjoyed his youth, the invincibility he possessed that came with having his entire life stretched before him and the possibilities that awaited his every footstep, and how endless it all seemed, that even in a young Black boy, it was still present.
Thank you so much. And Jotham?
All of a sudden, excuse me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hold on. Why don't you guys chat for a second? I apologize.
Okay. Chatting about the character you just presented, Edward,
Yes.
which for me is the center of your book, Miss Lula, right?
Yes.
Whose life is about spite. So hang on to that, audience, that her life is about revenge. Jotham.
Wow. Okay. Thank you, Lisa. It's funny. You mentioned the Norman Mailer quote, and we didn't talk about kind of voice and the sound, right, of the music. As I'm listening to Edward, I'm thinking about rhythm of language. That's what I'm thinking about. Well, the novel is Spindle City, and this city is Fall River, Massachusetts, and the time is the early 20th century. In the late 19th century and the early 20th century, Fall River, Massachusetts, which is on the south coast of Massachusetts, was one of the leading cloth producers, textile towns in the entire world. And the book picks up in 1911, Fall River threw a birthday party for themselves, 100 years of cotton. It was the Cotton Centennial, and President Taft came to town. There's a number of characters in the book. And I think the big story is about how globalization works with textiles moving through the world, really still does. And another story is the story of the immigrants that made Fall River. You had your Yankees, you had your Irish, the middle class, to be real general about it. And then we had the operatives, which were a lot of immigrants from around the world. And Fall River always had a very strong, and still does, Portuguese community. So I want to read a section that I wrote probably early in the book. It's a kind of a backstory of my Portuguese character. His name is João Rose. He came, like a lot of Portuguese, from the Azores, which is kind of, the islands off the west coast of Portugal. And he's going to tell a story about a necklace and a girl. João had won the necklace on a sandbar 6 months before he left for the New World. Locals called it Parrot Beach for the bright rainbow of coral that lined the seafloor. Each afternoon, João gathered with his friends to dive for mussels and shells. One day, Lourdes, the prettiest girl in his group, challenged the boys to a contest. She unclasped her grandmother's gold necklace from her neck and tossed it underhand into the lagoon. The boys scampered to the edge of the sandbar as the necklace danced and quivered through the depths of the thickening light. The refracted rays warped the links and shrank the necklace bit by bit until it was lost on the shimmering sea floor some 30 feet below. Lord stepped to the ledge. I will marry the one who brings up my grandmother's necklace. She raised both arms high over her head. Ready? She dropped them. Dive. 10 boys jumped into the lagoon. 2 scrambled out, remembering their fear of the water. Lords and the other girls dropped to their knees, and they peered over the ledge at the tangle of kicking feet, their soles the palest patch of skin after a hot summer. Their brown bodies shrank, and then were lost in the sparkle of coral and fish. A trail of air bubbles burst on the surface, blocking the view completely. After 10 seconds, 3 heads bobbed above the waterline, each boy complaining of sore ribs and cuts and sharp elbows and nails. The girls on the beach laughed and threw sand at the boys. Lord's eyes widened as she dipped her face into the water. She knew only 3 boys could hold their breath long enough to find the necklace. 2 boys shot up on either side of her. They beached themselves half out of the water, heaving for air. One promised to buy Lords 1,000,000 golden necklaces if she married him. The other vomited. At 15 feet, the water temperature dropped 10 degrees. At 20, the ocean floor lost its golden shimmer. At 25, the colors muted. Schools of silvery minnows zoomed at the 3 boys, turned away at right angles, then whipped back around. A tall boy with angular limbs held a slight lead over Zhao and his best friend, Julio. The pressure built in their ears, their lungs burned. They knew to extend their strokes, to slow and glide. But what if the tall boy beat them to the bottom? Zhao stopped to clear his ears, Julio too. The tall boy continued a few feet, then faced them, thinking he'd won. Suddenly he seized up. His hands gripped his ears. Blood seeped from his nose and rolled up his face. Their pressure equalized. Zhao and Julio passed the tall boy as he shot toward the surface. Fish darted in his bloody wake. Zhao had pegged the necklace near an outcropping of red coral, but now he wasn't so sure. A cloud obscured the sun and everything went gray. The boys hovered over the sea floor, their legs parted above them, bent at the knee. With one arm, each frantically swam down, with the other flipped over rocks and shells. Small explosions of of sand clouded the water. Julio scurried over the rocks, rubbing his eyes after each stroke, as ribbons of blood seeped from barnacle cuts on his knuckles. Zhao swam toward a shiny patch of sand as Julio hovered over a crevice between 2 rocks. His arm plunged down and he pulled out a pearl oyster. He grimaced, then smashed the shell down on the rocks, slicing his palm. The sunlight returned. Zhao grabbed Julio's arm and the boy jerked around. Lord's necklace hung from Zhao's neck. Julio tossed the shards of the shell at his friend, then floated an inch, then tumbled down to the sand. Julio pinched off a rope of snot, then squatted to the sea floor and rocketed topside, his left arm ahead of him. Zhao peered up at the squirming legs on the surface. Water now flowed freely in and out of his mouth. He felt a constriction in his throat, and then a sharp pain seized him. Lords was promised to one of the boys above. His family owned 5 fishing boats. The boy would inherit the fleet. No dairy farmer's son working borrowed land, no matter how many books he could read, had such a future. But now she was his. He urinated. The yellow stream blew through the fabric of his trunks, floating, forming a jellyfish-like sack. He put the necklace in his mouth. He'd stay underwater forever with Lords, growing gills, living among the coral and shellfish. We can live in the underwater caves. Our children will have flippers. Flippers, yes, flippers. Zhao lost his grip on the rocks. Buoyed by the little air swirling in his lungs, his body ascended. An updraft of current propelled him, and then the warmer water triggered something. His legs kicked, but his arms trailed at his sides. He felt the sun and peered up. Black spots blotted the sky. A silvery trail of bubbles tickled his groin. His throat opened and a rush of salt water flowed down his throat. 15 feet from the surface, he stopped kicking, his body suspended, arms and legs splayed out like a frog preserved in formaldehyde. He didn't feel the hands around his waist or the fingers pinching his armpits. Lord screamed when his face broke the surface. Zhao's head rolled forward. A boy pulled his hair to keep his face out of the water. The tall boy clasped Zhao's swimming trunks and hoisted him to the sandbar. He rolled Joey aside and drummed his back with 2 fists. Julio was doubled over, shouting to his friend to breathe. After a few seconds of pounding, Joe vomited up 2 puddles of water. Joe! Lourdes sucked the back of her hand. The tall boy flipped him flat and blew into Joe's mouth. His chest heaved as he choked down gargantuan breaths. Joe opened his eyes and the crowd hollered. His bloodshot eyeballs rolled and he blinked hard, convulsed. He made a start to sit up and the tall boy pushed him down. He felt something fall against his throat and remembered Lourdes, the contest, the silvery minnows like knife blades. Joe fingered the necklace. He took a shallow breath and coughed. He rolled onto his side. Lourdes knelt close, her soft knees touching his silky chest. Her lips fell on his upturned ear. She rubbed Joe's back. In a low voice, she whispered, I'm yours.
Thank you. Very beautiful. So setting is really important for both of you. And I'm just, as you were reading Jotham, and I was thinking about how beautiful that underwater scene was, but also you capture New England, specifically, Falls River. And Edward, you capture Mississippi, and you capture a cotton plantation in Mississippi. So there is a little relationship here. Would you talk about how you used setting in terms of the themes of your novel, starting with you, Edward?
Yes. Setting was very important for me because I currently live in California, but I grew up in Memphis, and actually I grew up right at the state line of Mississippi. So we spent lots of our time in Mississippi, and my father's family is from Greenwood, Mississippi, where the story takes place. Mm-hmm. And so I always grew up seeing the cotton fields. And for people who don't know, when you drive into Greenwood, Mississippi, there's a big sign that says Cotton Capital of the World. And for me, it always meant something to see the cotton and to see that sign because we were often in Greenwood, Mississippi. But it also meant something because both my parents worked the cotton fields. And so when I went to write a story, I knew I wanted to, and it took place on a plantation, I knew it had to involve cotton. And I knew that that would be a big part of the characters' lives because it was a part of my life growing up. But it was just very interesting to me because my parents always saw the cotton differently than I did. And it's because they had worked the cotton. They had a different relationship with the land than I did. I always saw it as something beautiful, something I wanted to run around in. And my parents would see it, and they had deep memories, deep connections to that cotton. So it meant a lot to me to tell a story about Greenwood and about the people of Greenwood, Mississippi.
Oh, that's so fascinating. And Jotham, for you, it's interesting that your family was from Mississippi, from this area, and Jotham, you had family from where Spindle City takes place. Yeah. So would you talk about setting?
Yeah. And is it interesting that the cotton that came from where he is came up here, and they made cloth out of it, and then they shipped it back down there. So there's another connection I didn't even think of. How about that? Yeah, it's the same thing. I was born in Fall River, and I never lived here really. My father was a college professor. We were always moving around the Midwest, but I'd always heard the stories of the Great Fall River. And when you drive through Fall River, I did it today. You come over this bridge, and it kind of rises like this, and you see this town on this river, the Taunton River, and it's this to me, it's just like, what a gem here, with all the shoreline, and what is this place? And then as you continue on the road, there's these hulking granite buildings, right? And now it says Burlington Coat Factory, it says, it's a paintball place, and you're like, what are all these? I mean, there's a lot of them, right? There was over 100 of them. So I was always interested in it, and then my connection, my great aunt. So my great-grandfather was killed in a mill accident in 1915. One of the great belts that drive the machines snapped and hit him in the head, and no workman's comp. I mean, he went home and died, and then everyone had to go to work. Mm-hmm. So my great aunt would tell me stories, and when she worked in the mills, it was tough in the mills at that point. They weren't great pay, and I knew that I wanted to capture this. And when I started doing the research, and Edward, you probably did some research too. When you do the research, it just opens up so many opportunities. And as you look at it from a fictional lens, you just kind of say, like, how can I make this dramatic? And for Fall River's story, there was so much. It was almost, the cupboard was too full, really. And I use it. I'm wholesale. I use some of it in the book, but that was really, the connection was personal, and then it became a story of these characters, which was really exciting.
Well, and that leads me to my next question, which is historic context and temporality, the time frames that you both work with. And Edward, you've placed the story in the 1960s, which in the Jim Crow South. And initially when I was reading this, I was like, isn't that an interesting choice? He's writing about a plantation in the 1960s. Why that choice?
Yes, it's very interesting because I was born in 1982, so I was not alive. But I grew up hearing so many stories from my mom and my dad. And I felt that the research I did was really hearing their stories my entire life. And hearing my mom talk about working the cotton, because it's very interesting because some people have read it and they say, this feels like slavery times. And I have to remind people that my family still worked the cotton. I am the first generation who did not grow up working cotton in my family. So it's not this far off. At the time, it's so recent to me because I heard the stories. And so it was important to me to tell a story that reflected my parents' journey of working the cotton. And even though they're not slaves, they still have very little that they can aspire to, because manual labor and work in the fields was all that many Blacks had in that time. And there was not much hope that my mom and dad would do much more than work the fields. And so I tell people that my generation, I'm very proud to have written this story because I can talk about the hope that I have that my parents didn't.
And Jotham, your book is, you're talking about the sort of the peak of the textile industry. When the things were at their best. So you sort of had the time frame already set up for you. Am I right about that? Or did you come at it in different ways? Did you explore different times?
Well, I can't make it up that much. It handed it to me. And this big birthday party, I tell a story. I read the opening of Underworld by Don DeLillo, which has a very kind of shifting ensemble cast. He had an event. It's a baseball game in Atkins. So I knew when I found that was my way in. It was my structure, and there are a lot of characters. And I think, but I think they all have some skin in the game. So I knew I wanted to use the event. So it was a matter of then doing the thing fiction writers do. It was a composite. The whole thing was like a week and a half. I make all the good shit happen in one day. You kind of make that happen as a writer. But I just thought the story was so rich. I'm getting comments from people like they want to know like what's true and what's not true. It's not how I read the book, but I know that's exciting. It's like, what's the thing? And I'm kind of cagey about it because, it's all made up. If I start splitting hairs about it, I think I'll get confused, but I think it takes away from the journey of the characters. But I definitely use raw material right in the book. And that's fun for me. I like doing that.
Well, and your characters, both of you, have issues with power.
Yeah.
Power is a driving force. I mentioned, Edward, your book, Miss Lula, her whole life is about revenge, and her revenge is her child died, and she's punishing her husband. Jotham, with you, what really struck out for me, there's so many events that happen in Spindle City, but the story about Joseph Bartlett and his two sons, Hollister and Will. And Hollister has been abusing young women in the mill regularly, and actually really damages a young Portuguese woman so that she's scarred. And his father, Joseph Bartlett, is a very powerful man who sends him away to try to sort of redeem, so that he can become a better man and learn new ways. But I guess my question for you both, though, is the issue of power and how it plays in the characterizations you present here. Just talk about the decisions you made regarding power with the narrative.
Yeah. Well, I'll let Edward start. I mean, I thought you hit on it with his book, right? That drives her revenge. It drives everyone's decisions. It just like waves out from her. So, Edward, I'd love to hear more about that myself.
Yes, I feel that this issue of power, it's really important because much of the novel characters feel powerless. And in feeling powerless, they do things that they probably wouldn't normally do. And so I don't think that, it's funny, people talk often about like a villain in a novel. And I don't feel that this is a novel with villains, although the characters do bad things to others. And so it was really an exploration of what happens when you feel powerless, what happens when you feel trapped, when you feel that you can't go anywhere, you can't live the life you want to live, you have no options. And so much of the character's journey is searching for a way to have some control over their lives and not have their lives dictated and guided by those around them. And so that's that feeling of powerlessness that each of the characters, they explore. And it's funny because it's a natural feeling. Like I felt it. I hear it in my parents' stories of feeling powerless, feeling trapped. And then they do so much work to make sure that the generation after them has a sense of hope. And like they did with me, to make sure that I had a sense of hope, my brother had a sense of hope. But unfortunately, the characters in this novel, they're not so hopeful. They're really trying to take they're trying to get their vengeance now. and so they're feeding into that powerlessness by trying to take power away from others.
Whereas your characters, Jotham, are quite hopeful, I would argue.
Yeah, I think the Will and Helen are for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, the power issue, there's two levels of it. It's a great class divide, right? I mean, my great aunt, you lived in the Highlands, right? Toni Morrison always has that kind of that thing that changed. So if the Highlands, of course, that's where the Yankees lived. They had the money, and then you just went down the hill, and everything had a neighborhood that had a name then, right? You were below the hill, you were Portuguese, you lived here. So there was a class division that was tremendous. And I think Joseph resists that, and that's kind of spelled out pretty soon. And then the other one is just a gender divide, right? And we just had the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and I mean, these women, they couldn't vote. They could go to school, maybe 3 colleges, but they couldn't get good jobs. And I wanted to show that. And I really think the men, the white men, had this power, but allowed them to know what to do with it in the book, I think. And the women, I think, are the moral center of the book. And they force decisions to be made. And they're not very nice decisions. Maria, the one character that Hollister has, he physically abuses and attacks, she has a lot of power at the end, in a sense, in a different type of way. Mm-hmm. So I really think for me that Joseph kind of leads the front of the story, but it's the people behind him that kind of guide and pull the strings of what will happen till the very end of the book. That was fun to play with, and I really loved the women in the book, particularly. They were hard to write, but I liked them the most.
Well, it shows, actually, your love of the women characters, and the women particularly come to life in dialogue and scenes with men and with each other. I'm glad you brought that up, too, because both of you have very strong women in these books. And Edward, your narrator is a woman. Yeah. You're a man. So,
he is a man.
Yes.
I completely bought everything. Bernice's observations, her relationship with her brother, and her relationship with the housekeeper Silva, Silva's fascinating. Miss Lula, who all she wants to do is punish the world, is fascinating. So this is a question I'm asking you both. How did you, as men, approach getting inside your female characters?
I think I was lucky to be raised by lots of strong women. And so I give my mom so much praise and credit for being so stern. She was mean. And now I appreciate how mean she was, but she was a mean woman. And then she had so much support around her. I have an aunt who just retired from the Memphis public library system. And so she was very hard on us, and she always made sure we had a book in our hands. And I say a lot of Bernice's kindness, the narrator's kindness in the story, and her thought process is my aunt. My aunt is very judicious. She sees both sides of every situation, and she's not quick to judge. And then my mom is very fiery, and both my mom and both grandmas were very fiery women. And so Silva and her temper, but also her love, because her love is so hard and is fierce. It reminds me of my mom and my grandmas, who were fiercely protective of the family. And then so I was able to imagine these strong women in the story by thinking of women around me who had influenced me, and trying to put that on paper.
Okay, and Jotham?
Yeah, I love Bernice, by the way. I was impressed. I did say, I'm like, oh, this is a guy writing the book, and it was really, that was terrific. You know, my story's different. I picked up the book because I had to kind of two levels with the women characters. First, I had to kind of embody them. It was a historical novel, and there's a character in it called Sarah Strong, which is a good example.
Who I loved.
Yeah, and so if you, on page 91, though, he goes to her rooms, and that's a long story, but there's a line where it says, he sees on the wall, there's a picture, and he goes, above the table hung a photograph of labor crusader Jenny Collins addressing women operatives. Now, that was a real person. And when I could see her, and then I could read her speeches, and then I could say, okay, I need a composite character who's a little crazier than this, who I can make in a fictional setting, and then it becomes, so then I can physically embody who Sarah Strong is based on Jenny Collins, and then I can then begin to understand kind of what she wants. And then from there, I knew I amped it up. All of the women characters, I rewrote a lot in the end, because I would, as you're saying, they have scenes with a lot of talking. And I have to say, I didn't know what the hell was going to come out of their mouth sometimes. Especially Helen at one point, when she meets Will late, she's just on fire.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of fun.
It's a great scene.
Yeah, and then even the last scene, it's the last thing I rewrote. I got, I don't know your experience with our publisher. We do share a publisher. I was doing a lot of revision at the end, and finally they said, like, we're done. Like, it's over. They stopped sending me edits. The copy editor, he would send me the book back to look at, you know, and then after 2 rounds, and I sent them 60 edits in March, and he did not send the book back after that. He said, 2 questions, and I'm finished with you, brother. Because I was just rewriting the end, you know. They kept giving me the chance, and I knew it was serious then, like the book was going to come out. I'd seen the cover. I'm like, wow, I better work harder. But there was always the women I went back to.
So I'm glad you brought up Sarah Strong, because that's actually one of my favorite parts of the book, when she brings Joseph Bartlett to there's a name for it that I'm not going to remember. Okay, and she takes him to her building, and there's a different ethnic group on every floor. There's Italians, there's the French, there's the Portuguese, and they're all living in squalor. And it just was so beautifully done, Jotham. It's just, you took your time and you showed a real picture of how workers were exploited at that time. And, you know, that's really a real strength. You also do this, Edward. You, so power dynamics in this Southern family with Miss Lula and her much older husband, without giving too much away, he has had a relationship with the housekeeper that was sexual at one time, Silva, and we don't know the details of that relationship, but she's continued to work for him, and the book is called Pale because one of her sons is very pale. Well, I'm assuming that's one of the reasons you named it that. And then Miss Lula is very pale. Would you talk a little bit about naming the novel Pale?
Yes. So I went through a few changes with the publisher for the title, and I eventually landed on Pale. And I was very happy when I came across that title, when I thought of that title, because I thought about the characters and us as individuals, as people, and I have this belief, and I believe that it's shared by a good number of people, that I believe that people start off good. We don't start off bad. And I chose the title Pale because so many characters, all of the characters, in my opinion, they start off this pale color. They are, and a pale color is a color that's easily darkened, shaded by colors around it. And so I wanted to show characters who are affected by others around them and how that can take us from being good to bad, from having a light about us to a darkness about us. And so not only is the Mrs. A very pale woman, and her color comes and goes. She when it's darker, she's actually a little happier. When she's pale, she's miserable. But I really wanted to show how each of the characters are affected by those around them, and how those how they perform, they act towards others based on that, and they do evil things at times based on the actions of others.
Can you share with us some of those other titles? Is that okay?
I think so. I think it's been enough time. I can. So the original title of the book was actually Ape, and I really wanted to. I chose that title because I was thinking how, if we don't know who we are, because a lot of this story is a search for identity, and I kept saying, if you don't know who you are, you will easily believe what someone else tells you. And so if someone says that you're an ape, if someone says you're not a man, you're inhuman, you will believe it. And not only would you believe it, you could possibly start to act in ways that are inhumane. And so I had originally chosen that title because I really wanted to show how we can go from good to bad and how it's impacted by others around us.
And what about Spindle City?
And
would you show us your prop, by the way?
That was easy. Yeah, it's a spindle. My mom had one of these, and I had a reading recently, and I was fortunate with some people outside, and the guy brought one and gave it to me. These are the wooden spindles that were on the machines, and then you doff them, and then you could you change them. And a woman operative might have 300-400 of these things that she'd have to constantly be changing and watching out for, and they get paid per spindle. If you go on my website, there's a bunch of videos with my aunt. In 2000, before she passed away, I finally sat down with a video camera at 91 and made her remember all these stories. And I found the tape and a deck to play it in, so I re-edited them, and you can hear her talk about this. No, I don't have a great story like his. It started out being called Fall River because it was Fall River, but as a lot of towns in the Northeast, I've found out, are called Spindle City. And that was a nickname for Fall River. So that's what they call it, Spindle City, because there were so many spindles. And if you would kind of value your mill by how many spindles you had. And some had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, thousands.
So interesting. And before I open this up to the audience, I just wanted to ask you guys one more thing, which is, as debut novelists now, you learned something. You learned how to write a novel, right? As you were writing that novel. What can you share with people in the audience who may be working on their first novel? What tips, what words of encouragement?
Yeah, I guess I can start. My encouragement is to, I guess everyone says this, but it's true, to keep writing. And the reason why is because I set out to write a novel in 2005 when I graduated college, and I wrote Pale in 2013. And I wrote many things in those 8 years that some were good, some were bad, but it was all the process of being able to write something longer and to write something better. And then I wrote Pale in 30 days. So I wrote it in 1 month, and then I spent 2 years struggling to get an agent, and I landed the best agent I could ever ask for. And then we spent 4 years trying to get a publisher, and every day was a struggle, and some days were filled with tears. And so to finally be in this moment and to have a novel that I can share with everyone, my word of advice is to keep doing it. No matter how many no's, I had to say, okay, I can do this. I believe in myself. So just keep doing it.
Yeah. And the question reminds me, I remember Terry Gross asked someone that question, Lisa, a while ago. And the answer was, well, Terry, it's my first published novel. It's not the first one I've written.
Yes.
So I got another one in the drawer that no one's going to read. So my practice book. Again, it took me so long because I was just doing so many other damn things. But I think my advice is, again, the work's not so precious. There's no such thing as writer's block. And it's really about that character yearning, as Robert Owen Butler always says, like, what is motivating these characters? And it's fiction. I had a character say to me, and this is advice in graduate school. I had a teacher once say, your real life is no excuse for mediocre fiction. And that's a hard thing to hear. That's tough. And I just made the PG version of what he told us. He was pretty hardcore, but it makes it took me a long time to understand, like it does when you're a student, to understand what someone's telling you. Yeah. And I finally figured that out. And writing a historical book that had so much history, if it didn't entertain you, it got cut. You served the book, and then it's like those women characters. I didn't know what they were going to say, but I was going to let them do it and make it feel like it was authentic in that way. But that takes a while, and it goes back to your first question. It's about hearing the tone of the symphony. And, and it feel like with Bernice's voice, like there's not a note out of whack there, right? There's no twang at all. But it takes a while, or maybe not in his case, in my case, it takes a while to kind of get that perfect pitch. And you got to be patient, Every story, someone said to me, John McNally, writer, once said, every story has its own kind of gestation period, and you can't force that. And sometimes it works, and you're working on other things, but sometimes it takes, in my case, over 10 years.
Bringing it back to the music analogy, Miles Davis said it takes time to sound like yourself.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
With writing. You can tell the story all you want, but to tell it like you want to tell it, that's a whole other thing. So.
Yeah. And it's a lot easier to be an editor than a writer, I'll tell you, too, I figure.
Absolutely. A lot easier to be a teacher of writing than to be a writer. Okay, I do not, so this is new for me. I'm going to click on Ask a Question and see if that works here. Oh, I don't have questions from the audience yet. Okay, I'm opening this up to you guys if you would like to submit questions. And in the meantime, I'm going to go back to my own questions, which going back to themes in these individual books, redemption, Jotham. So Joseph Bartlett, as I mentioned earlier, has two sons, and Hollister is the one who abuses for a while, went through this period of abusing girls in the mill.
Yeah.
He gets sent away. Would you talk about his character and how he changes and the theme of redemption?
Yeah, well, he does a pretty dastardly thing. I had people email me, friends of mine, say like they read the first chapter and say, I hate that character. I don't want to read almost anymore because what he does. And it's pretty tough. But again, it's fiction. And I needed to have, from a writer's point of view, I need to have kind of extremes. And there's a lot of things going on in that first chapter, and all of them are pretty bad. And I think that in terms of his journey, again, it's the point of is he a major? It's an ensemble cast, but they all need to have, they all have to have their own journey. And for him, he had a problem, and his father, how did he solve his problem? As you said, he sends him away. And then, I don't want to give too much away, but World War I comes around, and Hollister goes to the war. And then I was thinking about him in this notion of redemption. There's only one character that can actually forgive him, and only one. So I knew I wanted to get there. I didn't know how I was going to do it. I'm not going to say how it happens, but when something does happen to Hollister in the war, and I knew then he has to go home, and what happens when he goes home. So, and that's the beauty of when you write fiction. In Edward's book, everyone's going to grow up and they're going to make decisions. And I knew he was going to get older and make some decisions, and that's why I can move time too, which was fun. I didn't know exactly. There's a scene at the end, I'm giving it away, when he and Maria are going to interact. I really didn't know what was going to quite happen. And then in the next chapter, she says something to her husband about, what she thinks of the whole thing. But that was my kind of motivation. I couldn't leave that story from what happened and just make it go away. It just wasn't going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I knew I had to conclude it. There's like 3 or 4 knots, right? And that was a big one. It was probably one of the tougher ones to figure out. But it wasn't is him making a decision. Other people had to do it on his behalf in a sense. And I don't know. I really love Maria. She's, again, one of these women that has to make a big decision. And it's the, decision we make today. But
well, I was also struck by the Hollister has a brother named Will who has a much different trajectory, and it's a different. He's not playing in the dark areas that Hollister does at the beginning of the novel. This brings me to you, Edward, because Silva has 2 sons, Fletcher, and then the other one's name is
Jesse.
Jesse. And Fletcher gets to go away to school. He gets to escape the plantation and see another part of the country. And he is forced to come back to the plantation because Miss Lula is set on making her husband suffer. Would you talk about, because your story has redemption too. There's terrible things that happen, and yet, would you talk about that? Would you talk about Fletcher's dilemma and how he's forced to come back to the plantation?
Yes, that was a hard part to write. Not many parts of the novel were difficult, but I think, as Jotham was saying, we sort of follow the truth of the story. And so the truth of the story is that he could not live the life that he wanted to live and the life that was being offered to him. And an escape from Mississippi, he was forced back. And a large part of my writing process was to write about what that would do to a person. What would it do to have such hope and promise and have that taken away from you? And I believe that the redemption that each character is seeking, by the end, it comes to this idea of some characters actually receive redemption in ways, and then some redemption is as small as being alone with your God at the end of your life, at the end of the day. Maybe that's redemption enough. And that's what I wanted to explore is maybe we don't get the redemption that we wanted, but maybe it comes in smaller parts, and something as small as being with God at the end of the day, end of your life. Maybe that's enough.
Okay. We have a question from the audience. Given the personal nature of your stories, what did your families think of them?
My family, well, most of them are passed away that lived in that time, so I think I have a little filter from it. I did have, I'll tell you this story, but when you go to Fall River, like any old place, the family names are still there, right? You still run into Bordens and Durfees and Buffingtons and all the people that own those mills. And I did run into a woman who's in her probably late 80s, and she says, in the first chapter, you have Uncle Matt is in the first chapter, and he's talking to, I can't remember his name, one of his sons, and he goes, I knew the other son. He was my Uncle Bert. And then she goes, you didn't like my people very much, did you? But she says, you got it right. And I think that's what I want. I mean, not that I needed to hear that. For me, that was a sense of authenticity of kind of the emotional truth of the piece. I mean, she knows they're fictional characters, but so that felt good. And I really I'm so bullish on Fall River. I love the place. It's fallen on hard times the last literally 60 years. Yeah. It's right near New Bedford. People know New Bedford. So I'm really hoping that, it has a second life. It's a great place.
And how about your family, Edward?
Yes, I make fun of my family because they believe that everything is about them. And so I actually have a cousin named Jesse, and I have a cousin named Floyd. And so everyone, and I used to work on a farm. I used to help out a man named Mr. Fletcher. So everyone believes that this story is about each individual family member. And I tell them, this story came to me in a dream, and it's all fiction. Don't worry, people. I'm not putting out any family secrets. So it's been fun to poke fun at my family.
So very good. Well, we have time for another question here. What is the process of keeping track of characters and timeline? Do you take notes? Do you draw up cards, flow charts, colors? None?
There's a couple different ways. I mean, very practical way, of course, is all the things you discussed. I mean, you gotta kind of know where you are in time. I mean, in my case, I couldn't make up a cotton thing that didn't happen. So I kind of picked those dates. World War I was another big event I wanted to get to. I remember Mary Carr, who wrote Cherry and a bunch of memoirs. I'll never forget. I saw her years and years ago, and she said, my editor just said, well, how about the next chapter you say 10 years later? And then she was like, I can do that? Like, just skip time. Yeah, you can do that. So you don't have to be so rote with it, but I think you have to have that track. That's what I meant earlier. You have to have the book in your head. I know in my book, there's a lot of people, they're moving around. I had to have lists. I had to know their names. I had to know who their father was. I had to know what their father's job was. And none of that goes in the book, but that's the work of being a writer, to make it feel authentic for yourself. And then it becomes organic to being characters. But that does take time.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And as far as me, my process, I am a pantser, as people love to say, and I actually didn't know much of anything, and I just sort of felt my way through the book. I don't think that's the best way to go. Now, but I kept saying that if it feels true, I'm going to allow it to be said, and then I'll go back and I'll look at it, and I revise as I go. So I can't write a paragraph, a page, without reading it several times to lead into the next. And so I think through that process, I am really getting rooted in the time, in the character, so I don't have to do as much planning on paper because I revise as I write.
See, that's impressive to me, because you say you wrote it pretty quick, and now you're revising as you go.
Yes.
A little jealousy on Jotham's part.
I am. This is miserable. He's going to publish like a dozen books.
We have time for one more question. Let's see. Did you find that your vision for each character stayed certain from the beginning work? I'm sorry, I just lost. From the beginning, or were you surprised by how much a character changed as you continued writing them?
I was surprised, for sure. I didn't know. The tough part about it, I think, when you're working on as long as I worked on my book, I had quite a frame, but then it was kind of the medium shot that really surprised me in scenes. One example, about 2 years ago, I put the book down for a while, did a couple of things, and then I'm like, I'm going to get serious about this. And there was a scene in the book where Joseph was Sarah Strong. You know the scene, Lisa, at the very end, what happens. And we learned suddenly that Sarah Strong speaks French. She's really into midwifery. She does a lot of things. And about 2 years ago, she knew none of those things. The whole scene was different. It ended kind of violently. And I think this goes back to having some feedback. And what, to me, it felt, maybe because I'd worked on it, like that had to be the scene. And I had a friend read it, and she was like, nah, I don't think so. It just doesn't feel authentic to this. And it's not opening the story in a new way. So I didn't really go back and look at Sarah Strong and really, like, where did she come from? Where did she go to school? Well, she does know French, and she can deliver babies, and she can do these things. And also then thematically, it created the tension between what Joseph thinks he has to do, and then the notion of the immigrants rising, and they talk about the Prince of Fall River. That all took a while for me, and I didn't know that originally. I mean, no, it's on page 90, 91. It came very late in the process.
And were you surprised like that too, Edward?
Yes, because I didn't, because I was really discovering my characters as I wrote them, especially Miss Lula and her husband, Mr. Kern. They surprised me because when we meet Miss Lula in the beginning, she's sitting in a room, in a dark room, and we don't know much about her. And she has this mystique about her. And by the end of the novel, you know so much about her. You know her struggles, this very sensitive woman, in my opinion. And then the same for her husband, who is a stern man. He's very stern, but by the end, you've seen his ups and downs, and you see a different side of him. And I didn't know that in the beginning. I didn't know how they would reveal these secrets about themselves to me and to the reader. And by the end, I was able to see the transformations, and I was really surprised. And I was really surprised by Fletcher because you see him as a boy, he starts off as a boy, and then he's a young man by the end, and he's grown so much. So he surprised me a lot.
Yeah, cool. And one more question from the audience. Is there any advice you could give for a novelist who has completed their debut work in the editing phase now and wants to begin networking to understand how the publishing industry works without having a background in English as a major area of study?
Edward, you want to take that first?
Yes, I would say.
About this.
I would say I was an English major, but I did not receive a Master's of Fine Arts. So I felt that I had such a disadvantage in a slight way, but I at least majored in English. But I didn't understand the process. And what I did was I Googled, and I learned how to Google everything. And I am obsessed with YouTube. And so I watched lots of YouTube videos, AuthorTube, BookTube, where they describe the process of how to query an agent, things like that. And so I would definitely recommend Googling as much as you can, and also reach out to authors. I think in the day and age we have now, reaching out on social media, people are very open to send a message back and to give you some advice as to how you can navigate the publishing world.
Yeah, there's great resources online. I think you got to know, I'll just talk then about the book. You got to know you think the book is ready. You've had readers. You have a reading group. I always tell people, like, someone will say, can you read my book? And I'll always say, like, well, where would you put it in the bookstore? How long is your book, right? And who's read it and given you advice? And if they tell me it's 300,000 words, I don't know what kind of book it is, and I don't know, my sister read it. I mean, they're not ready to send it to anybody. So, you got to kind of know what you have. But I agree with Edward. Another thing I remember about agents. Agents only have jobs if they have writers. And then if you have a solid, learning the format's easy. And if you have a solid pitch and you believe in your book, they're going to get back to you, not always positively. Edward's experience was, he took a while to find an agent. And then you got to remember there's New York publishing houses, and this whole COVID thing is really, more, I think, dissolved kind of the power of New York in terms of publishing house. And I mean, Edward and I are both with a publisher on the West Coast that is just terrific. So you can look at different types of publishers and independent publishers, university publishers, and if you keep writing, you're gonna write better. So your book will find an audience eventually.
And that's all the time we have. That concludes Lit Talks for this evening. Thank you, Edward A. Farmer and Jotham Burrello. I'm Lisa Page.
Lisa.
Thank you all for showing up tonight. Take care.
See you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.